Hey friends, it's Jill here with the Hometown Homestead, and today we're headed down to my bulk storage area to grab some beans. Because somehow, and I'm not really sure how this happened, but soup season snuck up on my house and my pantry was down to 2 jars of beans of all kinds. So today we're gonna stock up by adding pinto, black, and red kidney all in the same canner load. Now, some of you might be wondering, why canned beans? You can get them relatively cheap at the store. You can also just cook them when you need them. But the truth is, for me, quality is more important than anything. And I also need them to be easy to use. One reason that I like canned beans is for shelf stability. Another is the same reason that I like to pre-chop out my onions, which it just saves me a lot of time when I'm actually cooking a meal. And then the last reason would be flavor. When I get a can of beans from the store, I can always taste the aluminum a little bit, and you don't even really notice it until you've had freshly homemade beans or home canned beans, and there is really such a difference. So with those reasons in mind, if you are interested in learning how to can your own beans or finding out just how simple it can be, hang out because this one is worth your time. So first things first, I got 4 cups of dried beans of each kind and then brought them back upstairs for a good rinse and sort. There were very few broken beans, but I did grab those that were broken before covering the beans with water for an overnight soak. I repeated this same process with all 3 types of beans. The next morning, I pulled them out, still keeping them separated, rinsed and discarded the soaking water. My plan was to get all of this accomplished before the kids woke up for the day, which didn't quite happen, but for the most part, they were still asleep, which helps me move a little bit faster. The beauty of canning is that most of the actual time involved is hands-off. So it's pretty easy to make this happen during a morning routine or throughout our homeschool day. Next, I prepared the canner with 2.5 inches of water and a few ounces of vinegar. Sometimes I forget the vinegar, and when I do, I always regret it because the jars just come out nasty. The cleanup is a lot more intense, so that's up to you, but I personally prefer the vinegar. Some decide to leave it out because they don't want any discoloration of their rings long term, but for me, that is totally worth it. I like my jars as sparkly as they can be, so the vinegar splash in the water is a huge help. As you can see, my oldest has woke up as usual. He's always my early riser, and he's quite curious about what I'm up to. He loves to cook and help out in the kitchen, so I like to take the time to show him what I'm up to. Now it's time to fill my jars. In preparation, I have my jars clean and warming in the oven. I personally prefer to use the oven. Again, there are many ways to keep your jars warm. My lids and rings were also prepared and all supplies close and ready to roll. At this point, my beans had already been covered with fresh water after their rinse, placed on the stove and cooked for 20 to 30 minutes or simmered for 20 to 30 minutes until they were slightly tender but not fully cooked, which is something that will complete in the canning process itself. Jars were left with 1 to 1.25 inch of headspace to make room for the expansion and covered with water left from the pot, then topped with boiling water from the kettle until the desired headspace was achieved. The rims were wiped, lids and rings screwed on, and then in the canner, and they were ready to go. I repeated this process with all 3 kinds until all 19 pints of beans were loaded into the canner and ready to go. I did have some extra beans left over at the end, so I went ahead and let them simmer on the stove and threw in a batch of cornbread, which I'll show you a little bit later, while we worked on our schoolwork and had our lunch automatically ready to go for the afternoon, which was another huge win for me when I'm trying to get all this wrapped up plus school completed. I will say though, I've never actually served brown beans and cornbread to my kids at home. I had a couple who loved it and a couple who didn't. So I'll let you decide how that works at your house, but it definitely was something that was a really nice win on the end of a long canning day. Placing the lid on can be a real pain until you get the hang of it. If you're curious about how to apply your lid successfully, make sure to check out my video on my first experience trying to put mine on, It's titled All American Disaster, and I'll link it at the end. It was actually the video that inspired my YouTube channel and gave me the confidence to turn on the camera, because I knew if I had that much trouble and couldn't easily find the answer in all the time that I had spent watching videos on YouTube about canning, then somebody needed to make it, and it was gonna be me. Make sure to check that out if you haven't seen it yet, because it is definitely an education in the All-American canning lid. Now that the lid is locked in place, it's time to crank up the heat and vent the canner off by timing for 15 minutes once you have a steady stream of steam escaping from the vent. And I actually love to use my little lid and put it up there to where you can see the steam escaping, because it's kind of hard to catch on camera. After the 15 minutes, it's time to add the weight to the appropriate pressure for your altitude. Here I can at 15 pounds of pressure, and these pint jars will process for 75 minutes once the weight starts to jiggle for the very first time. School time as the beans process, and here is the cornbread that I mentioned previously. The timer has already completed on the processing of the beans themselves. I left the canner come back down to zero pressure. Now this can take quite a bit of time, so just know that going in. It's gonna take some time for that canner to come back. Then we remove the weight and let it set another 2 minutes before unscrewing the lid. This allows the pressure inside the canner to equalize and fully escape, which helps to prevent any siphoning of your product inside your jars. I did have a tiny bit on one of my jars. A little bean juice came out, but they all sealed just perfectly and came out beautifully. Now it's time to pull out the jars. So I'm gonna set them on the counter. They're gonna stay here untouched overnight, and as they cool. They're super hot, and they even still bubble for a while. So day 3 of my project bean is here. What could possibly be left? Well, we gotta remove all the rings, check the seals and make sure the buttons are pressed down. And then the jars can get pretty nasty during the canning process, which I mentioned earlier. At this point, you wanna take them over to your sink. You wanna scrub them down with soap and water. Now, I always try not to get the water too hot during this process because I don't wanna loosen the seal on that lid itself. As I'm drying and labeling here, check out the little cuties that are up early this morning. Big brother is helping out little miss with some breakfast planning since I'm finishing up a project. I've said it several times, but having 5 kids is definitely easier than having 1 or 2. Older siblings love helping out with our little ones, and they really do a great job. So if you're in the trenches with 2 littles, just know that it won't always be this way, and every single baby is an absolute blessing. Now it's time to fill my empty pantry shelves. I keep my beans in the kitchen since I grab them often, as well as canned tomatoes and spaghetti sauce, which I actually canned up later in the afternoon as well. I did not grab my camera for the sauce making, but it felt so good to get these empty shelves all filled back up. So the big question is, what's the cost breakdown on the beans? Is it really worth it to do it yourself? The jars of organic beans came to 86 cents a jar. To save even more and a lot of time, you could cook them up and skip the canning process, putting them into freezer bags and then just lay them flat in your freezer. And that way, when you need to pull them out, you can easily quickly thaw them in warm running water, or you can just throw them into your pot of soup while you're cooking. If you were to use Ziplocs, that would come to 62 cents instead of your 86 cents. Those prices are when purchasing the organic beans bulk from Azure Standard. I do get credit for referring, and I genuinely appreciate each and every one of you who use my code, subscribe to my channel, and watch my content. Conventional beans came in at 65 cents per pint jar, or 41 cents per bag. Another option for saving is to can in quarts instead of pints, and that would cut your lid cost substantially, but we actually prefer the smaller batches. The savings come out to 30 to 50% depending on your method of storing and where you purchase your beans. If you're interested in more canning content, make sure to subscribe because I am canning up a bunch of different meats this week, plus have some garden vegetables coming in hot. Thanks for stopping by the Hometown Homestead. I appreciate you very much. If you have any questions, make sure to drop them below, and I hope to see you back really soon. Bye, friends.